Hey, welcome to Genesis class, and tonight we are covering chapters 8 through 11. So we left Noah in the middle of the flood. Hopefully he's doing okay. We'll find out here in chapter 8. So let's begin by looking at verses 1 through 5. Blake, you want to read those verses?
1 through 5. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. The rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters receded from the earth continually. At the end of the 150 days, the waters had abated. And in the 7th month of the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. And the waters continued to abate until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen.
Okay. The turning point in the flood story happens with this statement, then God remembered Noah. Now let's ask the question, what does that mean? Had God forgotten Noah and all of a sudden he's like, oh man, Noah's down there in that flood, I got to do something. What does the expression mean when it says God remembered somebody? We're going to see it a few more times in the book of Genesis. No ideas? Luke?
Like God has mercy on.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, having mercy on them and acting in a way to bring deliverance to them, whatever the situation might be. So here, when it says God remembers Noah, all of a sudden the flood waters begin to decrease, okay? Later on, we'll see that God remembers Abraham, and he delivers Lot from Sodom because Abraham had interceded for Sodom. And then later we'll be told that God remembered Rachel, and she became pregnant and gave birth. So it's always in the context of God doing something to bring someone out of like a crisis or a difficult situation of some kind. Okay, so those are good words. When we first read them, if we know what that expression means, we're like, oh, good news is about to follow. Now, one of the things that these verses highlight is we've been talking about the fact that the flood is creation in reverse. And now that the flood waters are beginning to recede, what we begin to see is a lot of similarities with the original creation story. So I'm going to post up here a lot of different similarities. So the two lines mean parallel. So on day one, remember everything was formlessness and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters, right? Well, here in chapter 8, verse 1 going into verse 2, we have this idea of the earth and the waters and the deep. And then also the mention of a wind blowing over the waters. And this is the same word used in Genesis 1:2, because the Hebrew word for spirit also means wind or breath. And so it's context that tells us how to translate it. So language-wise, this is all very similar. A lot of the same words being used here to describe now as the flood begins to recede. On day 2, in verses 7 and 8, we learned how God created the firmament and separated the waters above from the waters below. And at the end of verse 2, we read how the fountains of the deep are stopped and the windows of heaven are restrained. So this reminds us again of what God did by separating the waters on the day of, in the creation account. On day 3, chapter 1, verse 9, this is when God separated the waters from the dry land so that the dry land could appear. And in verses 3 through 5, we begin to read about how the waters are decreasing and now the mountaintops are visible. So dry land is beginning to appear. Okay. Now with day 4, there is no parallel since the sun, moon, and stars already exist. So we don't find anything here in chapter 8 that parallels that. Now we're going to jump ahead to some verses we haven't read yet, but since we're in the middle of showing the parallels here, we'll continue. So on day 5, remember that the birds and the fish were created. No need to mention the fish because the fish were never destroyed since they could live in the waters. But we see the mention here of birds as Noah sends out a raven and sends out a dove. So that reminds us of day 5 when God created the birds. Day 6 was the day he created all the creatures that move on the ground. And when we get to 8:17, we'll see a reference to that. And that's way further down the chapter. And then finally in the next chapter, we'll see a parallel actually with Genesis 1:26 that talked about how God created man in his own image. And there'll be a reference to that again when we get to chapter 9 and verse 6. So again, if we had one similarity, it might be coincidental. But all of these similarities suggest that the creation story is purposely being recounted. And so what we have here is a new creation or a recreation taking place. And we're also going to see down the line that there are a lot of interesting similarities between Adam and Noah, which will further strengthen the fact that these parallels are significant. Any questions on verses 1 through 5 or anything that we've put up here? We're not taking the time to read all of this because I think you remember chapter 1 well enough. And we're presently going through chapter 8, but the passages are there to show the parallels. Okay, so Luke, if you'll forge ahead then with verses 6 through 14.
So it came to pass at the end of 40 days that Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made. Then he sent out the raven, which kept going to and fro until the waters had dried up from the earth. He also sent out from himself a dove to see if the waters had receded from the face of the ground. But the dove found no resting place for the soul of her foot, and she returned into the ark to him, for the waters were on the face of the whole earth. So he put out his hand and took her and drew her into the ark to himself. And he waited yet another 7 days, and again he sent the dove out from the ark. Then the dove came to him in the evening, and behold, a freshly cooked olive leaf was in her mouth, and Noah knew that the waters had receded from the earth. So he waited yet another 7 days, and sent out the dove, which did not return again to him any more. And it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, that the waters were dried up from the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and indeed the surface of the ground was dry. And in the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry.
Okay, so the drama here is all about the drying up of the earth and then the sending out of these various birds. Why do you suppose he sends out both a raven and a dove? Any ideas? No ideas? Well, I don't know a lot about birds either, but from what I've read on commentary of these verses, the raven is a bird that can exist outside in higher elevations. And so once Noah sends the raven out, the raven never returns. He could perch himself on top of the ark, or he could perch himself on top of one of the mountains that have uncovered. But the dove is important because the dove is a valley bird. So the dove lives down lower. And if the dove returns, it means the waters are still on the earth. And when the dove finally doesn't return, then Noah knows that the waters have dried up from the earth. So it's an interesting way of testing whether the earth is dry or whether it's not. And then even after the dove doesn't return, Noah still waits a while longer. In fact, he's going to wait for God's command to come out of the ark. So it's a long waiting process. But really, that's all I've got to share in these verses. You guys got any questions about anything in these verses? If not, we'll move on. Okay, so now we're looking at verses 15 through 22, where Noah and his family are finally able to leave the ark.
Then God said to Noah, "Leave the boat, all of you, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Release all the animals, the birds, the livestock, and the small animals that scurry along the ground, so they can be fruitful and multiply throughout the earth." So Noah, his wife, and his sons and their wives left the boat, and all of the large and small animals and birds came out of the boat pair by pair. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and there he sacrificed as burnt offerings the animals and birds that had been approved for that purpose. And the Lord was pleased with the aroma of the sacrifice and said to himself, "I will never again curse the ground because of the human race, even though everything they think or imagine is bent toward evil from childhood. I will never again destroy all living things. As long as the earth remains, there will be planting and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night."
Okay, great. So in verse 15, God speaks to Noah and he gives him the command for he and his family to come out of the ark. If you look at verse 17, what does this language remind you of? Every living thing of all flesh, birds and cattle, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, so that they may abound on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. Genesis 1, isn't it? The same language. So as I mentioned, this is parallel to the creation on the sixth day when God made all of the animals and then blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply." He does that again here. And what is Noah's first action that's recorded once he comes off of the ark? Sorry? Yeah, he builds an altar and then does what with that altar? Right. Some of those clean animals that had been brought on board, right? Or brought on board. And we're told in verse 21 that the worship of Noah and presumably his family and the sacrifice that's offered is pleasing to him. And it prompts the Lord to say, "I'll never curse the ground again for man's sake." Now, what has changed since the flood has happened to cause God to say, "I will never curse the earth again for man's sake"?
Noah's sacrifice?
Okay, we might think maybe Noah's sacrifice has really touched the Lord's heart. But what does God go on to say? "I'll never curse the ground again for man's sake." And what?
Although my heart is still evil, like even though man's heart isn't going to change.
Yeah. So what we have here is the same kind of description we had back in chapter 6, how the thoughts and intents of people's hearts was only evil continually. So in one sense, absolutely nothing has changed, but God in his mercy just determines, "I'm not going to destroy the earth again in this way." So it's really a fabulous statement about God's grace, and that he's just going to deal with the sin, and rather than wipe human beings out again, he's going to deal with it in other ways. So we have this poem again in verse 22, celebrating this promise that God makes to never destroy the earth again, and that while the earth remains, seedtime and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease. So good news as Noah and the family depart the ark. Now, someone's also mentioned that, we see the number 7 here a number of times. Again, Noah sends the dove out, waits 7 days. The dove comes back. He waits another 7 days. So the number 7 is mentioned a few times. And it's suggested, since what we have here is a story of recreation, maybe the emphasis on the number 7 recalls the original 7 days of creation. So here in chapter 7, as well as chapter 8, we have this mention of 7 days several times. Okay, so I have a few things that I want to step back and look at the big picture of the flood. But before I do that, is there anything in chapter 8 that's come to you that you want to talk about, perhaps?
The flood sort of almost like a type of baptism. Almost.
Yeah, that
Sort of like the sort of immersion of the entire earth.
right.
And God promises not to curse it again, even though it's still not perfect.
So the water is a symbol of cleansing, isn't it? And in the New Testament, the flood of Noah is compared to Christian baptism, isn't it? So there is a cleansing that has taken place of the earth. But God recognizes, in spite of that cleansing, that as human beings begin to populate the earth again, their heart hasn't changed. And so sin will end up growing once again. Good thought. Luke, anything else? Okay, now one of the things that's interesting about the flood is that dates are given throughout the flood narrative. This is significant because it says this is something that's historical. It's something that's dateable, okay? So how is it dated? Well, there's only one man and his family on the earth, and so it's dated according to the age of Noah. But we have in 7:11, the flood beginning in Noah's 600th year. We're told it was the second month, the 17th day. And then you can look down the list at the various other dates that are given until we get to 8:14, where the land is dried. It's in Noah's 601st year. It's in the second month, the 27th day. So the flood lasts a year and 10 days. Okay, and we don't know if that's a lunar year or a solar year. So it could be anywhere from 370 to 375 days or something like that, okay? But it's dated very precisely, and that's interesting. Now, we've also talked about the fact that Genesis is full of chiastic structures. Well, guess what? The entire flood narrative can be outlined in a chiastic structure. And what is the center of the chiasm? The X? When God remembers, because that's when everything begins to change and things start to reverse. Okay? So I'm not going to go through these point by point. And I don't expect you to write all this down, but it will be available online if you want to look at it in the future. But there it is. Once again, the flood story is not only a powerful story, but it's told in a very artistic and beautiful way. Okay. Another way to view this chiasm is to look at the numbers that are given in the flood. And they're also in a chiastic arrangement. So we have 7 days of waiting for the flood, then 7 more days, and then we have 40 days of flood, 150 days of the water triumphing, 150 days of the water waning, 40 days wait, 7 days wait, 7 more days wait. So 7, 7, 40, 150, 150, 40, 7, 7. Chiastic structure as you follow the numbers through the account of the flood story. So again, just beautifully and artistically told. Now, we know that the ark was set down in the mountains of Ararat, and Ararat is a region. It's more than just one mountain peak. And so that's why people today continue to search for Noah's Ark amongst the mountains of Ararat, because the Bible doesn't identify one specific peak. It only identifies this range. But here's a modern map just to give us an idea of where it is. And you can see almost in the center, the area called Armenia, modern Armenia. And in the little red box, we have Ararat. So this is the mountain range that runs actually through that area. So you got modern Turkey, Armenia, way down in the south corner there, you've got Iran. So this is the area of the world where the ark landed and where Noah and his family got off the boat. And from there, eventually, as they begin to have children, people begin to spread out upon the face of the earth once again. There are a lot of reports. If you get on YouTube, you can see it all the time. Noah's Ark discovered here, Noah's Ark discovered there. But there's no firm archaeological evidence yet that we can point to and say, yes, absolutely 100% Noah's Ark has been found. Okay, so ready now for chapter 9. And with the beginning of chapter 9, we're starting all over. We have a blessing on the new humanity. So just as God blessed the original couple, Adam and Eve, now he will bring blessing on Noah and his family, and things will begin anew. So let's see. Before we read, let me put a few more points up. Some outline the early chapters of Genesis this way, and this will be good to know, maybe even for the midterm. Chapters 1 through 5 as creation. And we make up a new word here, chapters 6 and 7, uncreation, because it's the reversal of creation, right? And then chapters 8 through 11, recreation. So we can look at Genesis 1 through 11 through these three words. It's a nice little outline to help us remember the content of each section: creation, uncreation, recreation. Okay, so we've got a lot of verses here to read, 1 through 17. I think we'll break this down. Let's start by reading 1 through 7. So, Corinna, your turn? Yeah.
Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you will fall on all the blight beasts of the earth and on all the birds in the sky, on every creature that moves along the ground, and on all the fish in the sea. They are given into your hands. Everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I give you the green plants, I now give you everything. But you must not eat meat that has its lifeblood still in it. And for your lifeblood, I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal, and from each human being too. I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by human shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind. As for you, be fruitful and increase in number, multiply on the earth and increase upon it."
Okay. So chapter 9, verse 1 begins with, "So God blessed Noah and his sons." There's our favorite word in Genesis. This idea of God's desire to bless. And how does he bless them? Yes, be fruitful and multiply, right? We've seen that before. Genesis 1. And God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply." So again, we're hearing these echoes, which is telling us we've got a recreation story happening before our eyes. But in spite of the echoes that we have from Genesis 1, we also notice there's some things that are different. What is different about the earth now from what it was when God first created it with Adam and Eve?
Is it that the animals will fear them?
Yeah, we have this mention of the fear and dread of the animal kingdom. So that's one difference. We didn't have anything like that. We had simply the idea of Adam and Eve ruling over the animal kingdom and the fish of the sea, but no mention of this disharmony and this fear in the relationship. And what else? How about the end of verse 2 and the beginning of verse 3? This is different. Yeah, Luke, share with us what it is.
We doesn't specify that it doesn't categorize what animals it can be, just meat or
Right. Whereas in the creation account, what was to be eaten?
just the fruit.
Yeah, the fruit and the vegetation that grew. God told Adam, I've given you all the vegetation that grows and the fruit from the trees. No mention of eating meat at that point. So again, even though this is a new creation, sin has marred this creation and things are a bit different from what they were in the beginning. Okay, and God makes this prohibition with Noah that the blood is to be drained. So if you eat the meat of an animal, the blood is to be drained. So this doesn't simply start with the Mosaic law. This actually goes all the way back to Noah. And if you remember the story in the book of Acts, when there's this big dispute over whether the Gentiles need to keep the law of Moses or not and need to be circumcised. And they have a council in Acts 15 where Paul and Barnabas come down, they gather the apostles and the elders in Jerusalem, and they make a decision. And they decide that the Gentiles do not need to observe the law of Moses. But they do ask the Gentiles to observe certain things. And one of those is not to eat meat with blood in it, which reflects back to the covenant here with Noah. If you're going to have Jew and Gentile fellowship, you can't sit down and eat meat that's full of blood because it's going to offend your Jewish brother. So that was one of the stipulations that was asked of Gentile believers, but it also goes back to the time of Noah. Okay. So God then says, he has this prohibition about taking human life. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood will be shed, for in the image of God he made man. So tell me a little bit about this. What kind of language do we have here?
Well, it repeats itself twice in chapter 5, or verse 5.
Yeah.
The sentences kind of say the same thing over.
Yeah, they do. What do you notice about the way it's formatted in your Bibles? It's poetry again, right? It's set off as a poem. So just like the very first poem in the Bible was about God creating mankind in his image, this is also set off in poetic form. And we once again have the mention of the image of God. So what we see here is that in spite of sin, human beings have not lost the image of God. They are still to be God's representatives. They are still his royal offspring, sons and daughters of the King. But unfortunately, that image is not fully clear in terms of the way we represent God. And God recognizes that by saying, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. In other words, everyone is created in the image of God, but I recognize not everyone is going to act the way I act. There will be human beings unjustly killing other human beings. And when that happens, their life will be required of them. But then he turns it around to something positive. So the poem finishes off on a positive note in verse 7. As for you, be fruitful and multiply. So he said that back in verse 1. He repeats it here in verse 7. And he says, bring forth abundantly in the earth and multiply in it. Okay, any comments or questions on these verses? Well, let's move on and read verses 8 through 17. Scholar.
Then God spoke to Noah and his sons with him, saying, As for me, behold, I establish my covenant with you, with your descendants after you, with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, and every beast of the earth with you. Of all that go out of the ark, every beast of the earth. Thus I establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is the sign of the covenant which I make between me and you, and every living creature that is with you, for perpetual generations. I set my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be for the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. It shall be when I bring a cloud over the earth that the rainbow shall be seen in the cloud. And I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. The water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. The rainbow shall be in the cloud, and I will look onto it to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. And God said to Noah, This is the sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth.
Okay, so if we remember, right before the flood, God came to Noah and said he was establishing his covenant with him. But here God now elaborates on the significance of that covenant after the flood. I got this little quote here that I think is really insightful. It says, the covenant with Noah plays an important role in the author's development of God's restoration of blessing. Notice where it occurs. It occurs between the original blessing of creation and God's promise to bless all the earth through Abram. So the story of Noah is not in a literary sense smack dab in the middle, but in terms of the significance of the flow of the narrative. We have the blessing at creation, and we have the blessing and covenant with Noah. And not too far in the distant future, we're going to have this covenant with Abram, which is going to not only bless Abram and his descendants, but intended to bless all of the earth. So God is a covenant-making God. God is interested and desires relationship with the people that he's created. Okay, and we talked a little bit about some covenants and covenant signs last night, but this is a good place to pause again and remind ourselves. So in the early going of the Torah, we have 3 covenants that are specifically mentioned. So we have this one here, right, with Noah. And what's the covenant sign? The rainbow. What's the next covenant that we're going to have? And we were just talking about it. Hint. Covenant with Abram. And what's the sign of the covenant with Abram? Yes, very good. Circumcision. And then what's the third covenant in the Torah? This is the one most people think of when they think of the law of Moses. Yes. So it's the covenant with Moses or with all of Israel. And what is the covenant sign? This is one that we talked about last night.
The Ark of the Covenant?
No. Any other guesses? Not quite. Here, I'll put it up for you. The Sabbath. Okay. So notice that with every covenant, there is a sign. What do you suppose that is? What's the significance of the sign?
So the memorial.
Exactly. It's like a seal, isn't it? And a way to remember the relationship that God has established. So we're under the new covenant with the Lord. What would be the covenant sign?
The Holy Spirit.
I think it's the sealing of the Holy Spirit in our lives. We could also, although the New Testament doesn't quite put it this way, we could say that the Lord's Supper is important in the sense that it causes us to remember the covenant, just the way circumcision and the Sabbath and the rainbow caused these guys to remember the covenants that God had made with them. But yeah, I think it is the gift of the Holy Spirit for the new covenant believer. Okay, so God promises once again that he will never destroy the earth, and the rainbow will be a sign that he will keep that promise. This is totally of God's grace. Again, no one's up in heaven twisting God's arm saying, you know, you nearly wiped out everybody with that flood. You better be nice to Noah and make a covenant with him and promise never to do this again. No, this is just God's heart. He doesn't want to destroy the earth. He doesn't want to harm his creation. And of his own volition, he graciously makes this promise. Okay, so now let's do the rest of the chapter, verses 18 through 29.
Okay.
Yes.
Now the sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated. And Noah began to be a farmer, and he planted a vineyard. Then he drank of the wine and was drunk, and became uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and went backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. So Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done to him. Then he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants. He shall be to his brethren. And he said, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and may he dwell in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. And Noah lived after the flood 350 years. So all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died.
Okay, good. So good and bad news here, right? We're introduced to, or we're reminded, I should say, that Noah has three sons. And the focus is now going to turn to the sons in the rest of this chapter, and then also in chapter 10. Now, one of the things I want to point out that we begin to see here in this story, and we've actually seen examples before, I was telling you that there are a lot of similarities between Noah and Adam. And so if this is a new creation, then Noah is the new Adam, okay? One thing we notice is that Noah tills the Adamah just like Adam does. We've already noticed that Noah is blessed the way Adam and Eve were blessed, to be fruitful and to multiply. Adam, of course, sinned, and there were curses that were pronounced. In this story, there is also sin, and as a result, there is a curse that is pronounced. Both sins involve the shame of nakedness. Okay, that's kind of interesting. And this next point jumps ahead in the story of Adam and Eve to also bring in Cain and Abel. But there's familial strife here in the family of Noah. And we can say, yeah, as we look back on Adam and Eve, there was also familial strife there between the sons. And then one of the things that is really interesting to me is that there is common vocabulary that is used to describe the very first sin of Adam and Eve, and then the sin here of Noah. So for instance, when Eve is deceived, they're in the midst of the garden. Here in this story, we are told that Noah is in the midst of his tent. Eve saw the fruit. Ham saw his father. Okay? And after Adam and Eve ate of the fruit, they knew they were naked. When Noah woke up, he knew what his son had done to him. And in chapter 3, verse 11, God says, "Who told you that you were naked?" And in our story here, when Ham sees the nakedness of his father, he goes out and it says he told his two brothers. So we have a lot of themes that parallel the story of Adam, and we also have a lot of similar wording when it comes to describing the sin. Not only that, the sin of Adam and Eve involves fruit, right? Taking of the fruit, the tree of knowledge. The sin of Noah involves fruit. He planted a vineyard and he drank of the wine and got drunk. So we could have added that one to the list as well. Ran out of space on my PowerPoint. So hopefully you're beginning to see really clearly that it's not by accident that the flood story pictures a reversal of creation, and then following the flood, we have a brand new creation. Noah is the new Adam. Just too many similarities and parallels to be a coincidence. Now, one of the things we might ask is, what's the point of all this? Why all these parallels and similarities?
This is the second creation, we'll call it, right? So this
Yeah.
could be analogous to the first sin of the second creation.
Okay, so what does that tell us about human beings?
We didn't change much.
We didn't change much. We still continue to sin, right? And what does it tell us about God? That he's faithful, and he still continues to deal with our sin and forgive and allow human beings to be fruitful and multiply and for life to continue on. So that if we got more specific, we could probably find some other lessons in this, but broadly speaking, I think these are some of the messages that are being communicated to us through the parallels that we see. Okay.
We have a question.
Yes.
Why do you think that God wiped everybody out and then he didn't do it again?
Yeah.
Because the first one didn't really take. The first wipe out didn't work. I know he promised he wouldn't do it, but why do you think he did?
Yeah, and I would only be speculating based on what we know of God, and that is that God realizes that human beings are going to continue to be wicked. So if he's going to allow the creation to continue, there are two choices. He can either continually wipe everybody out and save a family, or he can just bear with it, And God knows in his heart, the scripture tells us this, that Jesus was crucified from the foundation of the world. So God knows that there's going to be a remedy. There's going to be a solution for this sin. And in fact, even within the book of Genesis, God is already preparing a remedy by calling Abraham and choosing him and his descendants to be the carriers of this blessing. So that would be my response. Obviously, the text itself doesn't tell us, but if we step back and we look at the big picture of the Bible, I think that's pretty accurate.
So why do you think he didn't just do that to start with? Like, why even go through with the flood?
Yeah.
If he could just say, we have Abraham now, we're going to choose this guy.
Right. That's a good question. One that Genesis doesn't answer. So again, I'm only speculating. But I will say this, that I think the sin between the sons of God and the daughters of men was kind of a breaking point. When you have heavenly beings coming down and breaking the domain of heaven and intermarrying with the daughters of men, that creates all kinds of evil and wickedness. That it's like it multiplies the wickedness hundreds of times over. And God believes that it's best, to wipe it clean and start again.
in Samuel it says that it happened before and after the first.
That's right. Well, in Genesis 6:4, it says that. So the Nephilim will return. So apparently this sin between the sons of God and the daughters of men must happen again. Because if everyone is wiped out except Noah and his family, and yet we have Nephilim after the flood, what's our conclusion? Well, it had to happen yet again. But here God still restrains himself. He finds other ways to deal with the destruction of the Nephilim. And we'll talk more about that as we get to another passage in Genesis a little bit later. Okay, so one of the big questions here is, what is Ham's sin? Going into the tent and seeing the nakedness of his father and coming outside and telling his brothers. Historically speaking, guess what? We have three main interpretations. I know that shocks you. Maybe you've heard of some of them. What do you guys think the sin of Ham is?
I've read one of them could be gossiping to his brothers.
Okay,
He's going and telling what he saw.
right,
Maybe
right.
not in the hey, let's go help dad way, but dad's drunk.
Yeah, so what is Ham actually doing there then? It's a little bit more than just gossip. It's what? Yes, disrespecting. So he's not showing honor to his father, which is a huge thing in the ancient world. Honor was so important. Well, I'm just going to run through these quickly because it's just about our break time. So let me do this and then we'll take our break. Some have suggested the sin could possibly be incest. And you're like, what? How could it be that? Well, if you go to the law of Moses in Leviticus 18, 6 through 19, it says to uncover the nakedness of your mother, that it's actually your father's nakedness. Okay, so we have this expression, to uncover the mother is to expose the father's nakedness, because the father and the mother are one flesh, right? So some have suggested that this language of the father's nakedness actually means that Ham did something to his mother, okay? A second suggestion is that no, Ham did something to his dad, and it literally means the nakedness of his father, okay? And then the third is what you've said, Blake, and if you're getting used to the way I do things, I put the point that I feel most strongly about last, so I'm agreeing with you on this. We do have the passage in Leviticus that could make that interpretation possible, but there is no mention here outside of this phrase, nakedness of his father. There's no mention that Ham performed any kind of sexual act. And so it seems more likely that it has to do with this idea of dishonoring his father. Okay. Well, why don't we go ahead and pause right now and we'll take our break. Oh, you got a question?
Yeah. Why didn't Noah get in trouble for getting drunk?
Well, I think clearly it is a sin, and he experiences the consequences of that sin through the sin of his son. And he ends up even cursing a grandson, and we'll talk about that when we come back. But so, yeah, God doesn't like send a judgment down on Noah, but Noah certainly experiences the consequences of his actions.
And I think it's possible to know the effect of the wine. Say if it was the first wine that had been made.
Maybe so. Who knows? It's certainly the first mention in Scripture of it.
He says that Noah began to be a man of the soil, so maybe he didn't know. It was good juice.
This stuff's really good.
Well,
Yeah, who knows? Okay. All right, well, let's take a break. All right, so once Noah wakes up, and it says he knew what his younger son had done to him, verse 24. And so we expect if there's going to be consequences, it's going to be to Ham. But Noah says, cursed be Canaan. The servant of servants he shall be to his brethren. So what are we to make of that? Why is Canaan cursed? There's one good reason that has to do with the plot of Genesis, but as far as the actual historical event, it's a little fuzzy as to why. One of the explanations I've heard is because God had already blessed all three sons. Noah couldn't curse the son, so he cursed the grandson. Somehow we're to infer that the sin of Ham must have carried on also then through his own son Canaan. But within the bigger picture of Genesis, remember, it's the Canaanites, it's the land of Canaan that God is going to give to Abram because of their sinfulness. And so this curse on Canaan, saying he will be a servant of servants to his brothers, already anticipates the fact that God is going to take the land away from the Canaanites and give it to Abraham's descendants. Okay, so in the big picture, it's a little easier to understand. Here it's a little more challenging, but that is one explanation, that since God had already blessed Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah couldn't curse Ham, and so he cursed Canaan. And then Noah turns around and says, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and may he dwell in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant." So the two other sons are blessed. And this has echoes of the early story with Adam and Eve too, where we have both blessing and curse happening in the stories. And remember that in Genesis 4, Cain is actually cursed, right? He's the only human being cursed in those early chapters. Here, Canaan is cursed. So the second human being in these chapters who is actually cursed could be on the midterm. But I might want to remember that one. Noah makes a play on words here in verse 27 when he says, "May God enlarge Japheth," because the idea of Japheth in Hebrew is one opening one's mouth or enlarging one's mouth. So it's a bit of a pun on words, but it's interesting. He says, "May God enlarge Japheth, and may he dwell in the tents of Shem." Some have seen this as sort of a prophecy of how the Israelites would welcome in the Gentile nations. Japheth being a representative of, like, as we'll see, the European type nations and peoples. And Shem, of course, is the ancestor of Israel. So there may potentially be something to that. I'm not 100% sure. But then notice at the end of verse 27, "May Canaan be his servant." So Canaan is cursed with servitude on a couple of occasions here. And then we get the end of the Toledot in verses 28 and 29. It sounds very much like chapter 5, doesn't it? Noah lived after the flood 350 years, so all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. Which brings us to chapter 10 in our next Toledot, unless you guys would want to talk about anything else here at the end of chapter 9. You're happy? All right, well, let's move on to chapter 10. Another one of these wonderful genealogical chapters. And so we'll do some introductory talking before we begin reading. And we'll break this down and read it according to the sons of Noah and their descendants. But the genealogies here are often referred to as the map of nations, because it's from Noah's sons that the world is populated. He's the new Adam also in that sense. Just as everyone descends from Adam, everyone descends from Noah, okay? So the genealogy that is given of Shem, Ham, and Japheth actually doesn't just include people. It includes some other types of information. So we do have people or personal names in the genealogy, but we also have people groups or tribes or nations, and I'll point some of those out to you as we go through. And then we also have place names like Babylon and Sidon, which are mentioned. So it's possible that names like Babylon and Sidon, maybe it was an individual named that and people came from them, but it seems more likely what we have here are, we're not only being told the people who descended, but various nations and then various important cities that came about as a result of these descendants, all right? So I have a quote here that I think is pretty good in summing up what is going on in this chapter. This genealogy is not intended to list all of the peoples of the world. Instead, it is crafted to present the most important nations in the ancient Near East that are not part of the line that preserves God's promise of a Savior. For instance, none of the nations descended from Peleg are mentioned. We'll find out who Peleg is as we go through the genealogy. Now, the people that descend from Peleg, by the way, are the ones who lead to Abraham. Okay, and so Peleg is an ancestor of Israel. And as he's pointing out here, none of those descendants are mentioned here in this chapter. So it's not a complete genealogy. Okay, it's a representative genealogy. Also, among Ham's sons, no descendants are listed for Put. Put appears to be the Libyan people. And obviously, Put had descendants, but those descendants are not mentioned. So although there are extensive lists for the other three sons. So the number 70 is symbolic. There are 70 peoples or people groups mentioned in this chapter. So the number 70 represents this idea of the nations of the earth, but it's not a list that, you know, it's not like the phone book where we just sit and read it and go, when is this going to end? You know, it's not every single name and nation. It's a representative group. And we're going to learn why 70 nations when we get to the story of the Tower of Babel. Okay, if you guys are happy with that, I want to show you a couple of maps here. I like this map because it shows generally where the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth settled. And you'll notice that the descendants of Japheth are in the north, and they spread both into Europe, but also in the other direction toward like Afghanistan and India and that area. And the descendants of Shem are more confined to the areas of like Assyria and Babylon and Canaan and Arabia. And then the descendants of Ham spread out into Canaan and into Egypt and Africa, okay? And I like this map, and I'm gonna come back to it as we read. Because it points out where some of these names that we read, it points out the areas in which they settled. As we read through this genealogy, we're like, for the most part, I have no idea who these people are and where these places are. So a map like this is fairly helpful in doing that, okay? In fact, I think I'll leave it here and we'll just talk about, read through the genealogy and talk about significant people as we go through it. So we're going to begin then by reading verses 1 through 5. And verse 1 is an introduction, this new Toledot being introduced. And then in verses 2 through 5, we read about the descendants of Japheth. I think we're back to you, Blake.
Okay, 1 through 5.
Yes, please.
These are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Sons were born to them after the flood. The sons of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Juvan, Tubal, Menech, and Trias. The sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Rizpath, Togmara, The sons of Javan, Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanian. From these, the coastline peoples spread in their lands, each with his own language, by their clans in their nations.
Okay. So the list of Japheth's descendants is fairly short. There are 14 listed here, if you count them all up. And we can see some of these names on the map. For instance, if you come over to the far left of the screen, Javan is the Greek peoples. Okay. You mentioned, as you read, Madai over on the far right. Those are the Medes. Maybe you've heard of the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians, right? So those are the Medes. And then you can see the Hittites and several other peoples that descend from Japheth. The Kittim are believed to be people from the island of Cyprus. So this is the basic people group that comes from him. Now, what I want to point out, when you have a name like Kittim, or look at verse 4, the last two names in verse 4, Kittim, Dodanim, those are not the names of a person. They are the names of a group. The I am ending in Hebrew is plural, just like in Elohim, right? The I am on Elohim is plural, and it can mean the true God, or it can mean gods, plural. So when it says that Japheth had these sons, and among them were the Kittim and the Dodanim, it's talking about people groups here, not individuals. Okay. All right. I don't know if there's any name there that you're interested in talking about. Otherwise, we'll move on. You want to mention Magog? I was hoping if I looked up on the map, I could see Magog, but it's not listed on the map. But we know, of course, from Ezekiel, right? It seems to be up in the northern area, up above that area on the map where you see Sumerians almost in the middle there of Asia Minor, but farther up, and some located like in the area of Russia, southern Russia. So that's really all I know. They're mentioned here. Magog is mentioned here, and then the only other place is when you get to the book of Ezekiel, right? So that's all we've got on them.
And is this the Elisha that we know about? Or different one?
No,
Or
it's a different one. Yeah. Okay, so next we have the descendants of Ham. And Luke, those are in verses 6 through 20.
The sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. The sons of Cush were Seba, Havilah, Saptha, Rama, and Sapteca, and the sons of Rama were Sheba and Dedan. Cush begot Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. In the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Ir, Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah. That is the principal city. Mizraim begot Ludin, Anamin, and Lehabim after him, Pathrasim, and Casluhim, from whom came the Philistines and Caphtorim. Canaan begot Sidon, his firstborn, the Heth, the Jebusite, the Amorite, and the Girgashite, the Hivite, the Archite, and the Sinite, the Arvadite, the Zemarite, and the Hamathite. After the families of the Canaanites were dispersed, and the border of the Canaanites was from Sidon as you go toward Gerar as far as Gaza, and as you go toward Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and as far as Larsha. These were the sons of Ham according to their families, according to their languages in their lands and their nations.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now, we've mentioned there's two types of genealogies. There's the vertical genealogy and the segmented genealogy. So what kind of genealogy do we have here in chapter 10? Yes, thank you, Aoife. It's segmented because it's giving the descendants of the various sons. And then it's even giving some of the descendants of the sons, right? So this is a segmented genealogy, not a vertical genealogy. So that's one of the ways in which this genealogy would differ, for instance, from either chapter 4 or chapter 5 of Genesis. Now, we got a whole list of names here, don't we? There's actually 30 mentioned here. So we only had 14 of Japheth mentioned, but 30 of Ham. And there is a logic to the order that these names are presented in. What I mean by that, the names of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Japheth represents the nations that are the furthest away in terms of Israel having any dealing with them. And throughout most of the Old Testament, we see very little dealing with a lot of these nations. The descendants of Ham are peoples that Israel has much closer dealings with. And so more of them are talked about here in the genealogy. And that's why they're mentioned next. The descendants of Shem are actually the ancestors of Israel, and that's why they're mentioned last. Okay? So there is a rhyme and reason to the order that we have here. Now, if we go back to verse 6, we're told that the sons of Ham were Cush, Mitzrayim, Put, and Canaan. Cush in the Old Testament usually means the people of Ethiopia, although sometimes there seems to be a reference to a Cush in the land of Mesopotamia. And we're told that Nimrod is a descendant of Cush, and Nimrod is clearly in the Mesopotamian area here. So we're not sure if this Cush represents Ethiopia or Mesopotamia. Anyone know who Mitzrayim is? Yes, this is the Hebrew word for Egypt, okay? And notice it's in the plural again, Mitzrayim, I am. So it's talking about the Egyptians. It's not talking necessarily about a single person, although Ham could have named his son Mitzrayim, Egyptians, but you know, who knows? But we mentioned is the Libyans, and then Canaan, okay? And this is the most significant descendant of Ham as it relates to the history of Israel. So from there, we break down these various sons and the descendants who come from them. And I'm not going to belabor the point of all of those, but we do want to point out Nimrod in verse 8. It says, Cush begot Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore, it is said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And it talks about the beginning of his kingdom, and it lists a lot of the cities of Mesopotamia, ancient Mesopotamia. So Nimrod was, sometimes the genealogies will do this. They'll be given a list of names, and all of a sudden they'll pause and they'll tell a little story about a certain significant person. And that's what's going on here. Nimrod was clearly a king who ruled over various cities in the Mesopotamia area. And there's sort of mixed reviews on whether this language of verse 9 is positive language about him or negative language about him. Depending on which commentary you read, some scholars will say, well, there's nothing but compliments here. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. And that's where the proverb basically comes from, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. Other people will point out, of course, that Babel and this whole area has a very negative reputation in the scripture. And that the name Nimrod may come from the Hebrew word, which means to rebel. The Hebrew word is marad. Nimrod may come from marad, which would mean rebel. And so if that's what's going on here, then we are clearly being told that this Nimrod is a bad character. And the fact that the beginning of his kingdom is Babel, along with these other cities, and we're about to read about the Tower of Babel, which is a very negative story about the sin of human beings, seems to put more of a negative light here on Nimrod than a positive one. Okay, I want to skip down then to verse 15 to Canaan. And notice how much time is spent on describing Canaan, his descendants, and then the boundaries of the land that Canaan possesses. This shows you the that the genealogy is being very selective and highlighting certain things of importance. So again, the Canaanites are going to be central stage for Israel because this is the land that God is going to give to them. And so we're told about many of their descendants: Jebusite, Amorite, Girgashite, Hivite. And those are names we read elsewhere when we read about Canaanite peoples. And then in verse 19, we're actually given the borders of the land of Canaan. Okay, we're not given that with any other person, right? So we see there's quite a significance here to the Canaanite peoples. And that's why they're mentioned last and why so much detail is given. Okay, any other thoughts or questions on anything in this list? I know, I see your eyes glazing over as we talk about all these names that are hard to pronounce. All right, hang in there. We're almost through. Chris, you're going to carry us through the descendants of Shem, which will take us through the end of the chapter. So verses 21 to 32.
Sons were also born to Shem, the older brother of Japheth. Shem was the ancestor of all the descendants of Eber. The descendants of Shem were Elam, Asher, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. The descendants of Aram were Uz, Hol, Jether, and Mash. Arphaxad was the father of Shelah, and Shelah was the father of Eber. Eber had two sons. The first was named Peleg, which means division. For during his lifetime, the people of the world were divided into different language groups. His brother's name was Joktan. Joktan was the ancestor of Almadad, Sheleph, Hazarmaveth, Jerah, Hadoram, Uzal, Diklah, Obal, Abimael, Sheba, Ophir, Havilah, and Jobab. All these were descendants of Joktan. The territory they occupied extended from Mesha all the way to Sephar in the eastern mountains. These were the descendants of Shem, identified by clan, language, territory, and national identity. These are the clans that descended from Noah's sons, arranged by nation according to their lines of descent. All the nations of the earth descended from these clans after the Great Flood.
Okay. Have you ever had any Hebrew?
No.
Well, you do a great job of pronouncing these names. You sound like someone from Israel. Good job. So with the descendants of Shem, notice we have 26. And if you then total up the number of descendants listed, 14, 30, and 26, lo and behold, you come up with a total of 70 nations. In verse 21, we're told that the children were born also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber. Notice that Eber occurs in the genealogy, but he's not right after Shem. Why do you suppose it highlights that Shem is the father of all the children of Eber? Yes, so Eber is the word in Hebrew for Hebrew. Okay, so that's what Eber means. So Eber is the father of the Hebrew people. So that's highlighted here in verse 21. And then as we move through, we want to come down to verse 25 and talk about Eber's two sons, because something significant is mentioned here. We're told that the name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. So Eber has two sons, and something significant happens in their day. The earth is divided. And I like your translation, Chris. It's an interpretation, but I think it's the right interpretation. Why don't you read it again?
It says, Eber had two sons. The first was named Peleg, which means division. But during his lifetime, the people of the world were divided into different language groups.
Right. So Chris's translation is interpreting this verse to mean that what happens during the days of Peleg and Joktan is the Tower of Babel experience, when God divides the languages and spreads the people out on the face of the earth. And that's what it means by the earth was divided in their day. And I think that's right. And I'm going to share with you how in the very text itself, we have an interesting development here. So notice that Eber has two sons, Peleg and Joktan, but then we don't read any more about the descendants of Peleg. It picks up the descendants of Joktan and carries them through, okay? But after the story of the Tower of Babel, we're going to have another genealogy of Shem, and guess what? When it gets to Peleg, then it's going to trace his descendants, which is going to lead us to Abram. So Peleg is actually the ancestor of Abram. Now, if we look at a chart of what is going on here, in chapter 10, look at the left-hand column first, 21 through 32, we have a genealogy of Shem, brings us down to Eber, and then it takes us through the descendants of Joktan until we get to the story of the Tower of Babel in chapter 11. And we're told that in the days of Joktan and Peleg, the earth was divided. Following the story of the Tower of Babel, go to the right-hand column, we have the genealogy of Shem again. And it starts back with Shem, Arphaxad, Salah, Eber. But when it gets now to Eber's descendant Peleg, it takes the descendants of Peleg and traces them all the way down to Abram. So in other words, in the very way the story's told, the genealogy is divided around the Tower of Babel, just as the earth is divided during the story of the Tower of Babel. Make sense? You see what I'm saying here? One of the things I love about the Bible is frequently, if you observe not only what is written, but how it's written, it communicates a message. And this division of the genealogy of Shem is already communicating to us the division that happens in the days of Peleg, which is the dividing of the nations at the Tower of Babel. Any thoughts on that or questions? All right, well, if we come down to the final verses, notice in verse 31, it says, these were the sons of Shem, according to their families, according to their languages, in their lands, according to their nations. So we not only, again, have people, but we have language groups and nations being mentioned here in this genealogy. And then a summary in verse 32, these are the families of the sons of Noah. Now in verse 31, we're told that these are the nations according to their languages. But in chapter 11, verse 1, guess what? All the earth has one language. So this genealogy isn't complete until after the story of the Tower of Babel, but we're given the full genealogy except for the line through Peleg before the story of the Tower of Babel. Now we're going to find out how the languages developed, why people spoke different languages. Okay. Why not put both genealogies after the story of the Tower of Babel? What do we sense being communicated by having this map of nations or this genealogy of Shem, Ham, and Japheth before the story of the Tower of Babel? How does that affect you differently than it might if you read it after? These kind of things are challenging questions, but they're good Bible study questions to ask. Why is the story told the way it's told? What does it communicate? Well, if we follow on from the story of Noah, the sons of Noah were blessed by God, be fruitful and multiply. So when we come to Genesis 10, we're seeing the blessing of God, the fruitfulness of Shem, Ham, and Japheth as the nations spread out across the world. If the story was told after the Tower of Babel, it would simply sound like a story of judgment, because at Babel, the nations are scattered, right? tell it before the story of the Tower of Babel, it sounds more like blessing. And so there's two emphases going on. Chapter 10, you're reading and you're thinking, blessing, blessing, blessing. Then after the story of the Tower of Babel, you're thinking, oh, but there's more than blessing going on here. There's also a judgment that's going on. So you get sort of an emphasis of both. Plus, by telling this side of the genealogy first, story of the Tower of Babel, it leaves that other part of Shem's genealogy afterwards. And it does that little division thing that we were talking about, which emphasizes more the dividing of the nations that happens in the story of the Tower of Babel. Get a lot of blank stares here. What do you think? Are you overwhelmed tonight or just tired?
Probably tired.
Yeah, okay. No problem. I understand. All right, well, if there's nothing else in chapter 10, we're going to jump to the story of the Tower of Babel here in verses 1 through 9, okay? And guys, this is our last chapter, so we're not too far from finishing tonight, okay? All right, that'll perk you up.
The carrot.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Okay, so Genesis 11, 1 through 9, the Tower of Babel. Whose turn to read? Okay, Corinna.
Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other. So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth.
Okay, thank you. So we come back to verse 1. Now the whole earth had one language and one speech. And yet we had just read how all of the nations were divided according to their languages. So that's got to, catch you off guard for a moment and say, what exactly is happening? Actually, what we have going on here is there's a lot of similar words that occur at the end of chapter 10 and now reoccur in the story of Tower of Babel. So it's tying the genealogy that we've just read into the story of the Tower of Babel. So for instance, the word build, back in chapter 10, verse 11, we had Nimrod building his kingdom. Here in 11, we've got people building this tower. What do the people in Babel, why do they want to build the tower? What does it say? What are they trying to do? Make a name for themselves. Guess what? In Hebrew, the word Shem means name. So we've just finished reading the genealogy of name, or Shem. And now the people of the Tower of Babel, what they want to do is make a Shem for themselves, a name for themselves. The east is mentioned in verse 30. And here in chapter 11, verse 2, we read that they found a plain it came to pass as they journeyed, and it really should be to the east, not from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. So again, word similarities, and I want to come back to that idea of the east in just a moment. But then we have the word land being mentioned at the very end of chapter 10, and also frequently then in chapter 11. So a lot of word similarities that tie the narrative together at this point. Speaking of the East, notice that here we have another story about rebellion or sin, and we have people traveling to the East. Adam and Eve were sent east out of the garden. Cain went east after his sin, and now we have the people at the Tower of Babel traveling east to build the tower. So there's nothing wrong with the east, you guys. If you want to go east, it's fine. But in the book of Genesis, it's always a symbol of bad things happening, okay? So it's just a little clue. It's a motif is what it is. And it's a hint that what we have here is another story of rebellion or sin that's about to happen. Now, in my day, growing up, there was a Christian artist who you guys, I'm sure, have heard of, Michael W. Smith, right? And he had an album by this title and a song. This was the song that became the title of the album. It was called Go West, Young Man, Let the Evil Go East. And it's based on this whole idea in Genesis, how the evil goes east, okay? All right. So if you never learned anything else in Genesis class, you just learned the meaning of the Michael W. Smith song, which maybe you've never even heard, I don't know. By the way, here is a picture of what is known as a ziggurat. And this is in the city of ancient Ur, where Abram is from. And a number of these ziggurats have been uncovered by archaeologists over the years. And it's believed that when it talks about the Tower of Babel, it's this kind of building that is meant. And how many of you have already watched the John Walton video and what he has to say about the Tower of Babel here? So a lot of you have, okay. What does Walton say that the purpose of the tower was? Do you remember? Yeah.
Didn't he worship the stars or
That was for the gods to come down.
Not quite. Yeah, it's this idea of making it possible for God or the gods to come down from the heavens, okay? And as he points out in the story here, this is exactly what the Lord does. But in the ancient idea would be that there's a temple next to the ziggurat, and the ziggurat provides a staircase for the God to come down so that he can inhabit his temple, okay? But as Walton points out, the motivation of the people here isn't so much wanting to worship God as it is to make a name for themselves, as the story says. So the problem here, the sin is, they're not out to glorify God, they're out to glorify themselves. Okay. Now, by the way, this story, and I should have put this on a slide. I used to hand out a booklet that had a lot of different papers in it and showed chiastic structures and all that kind of stuff. The story of the Tower of Babel is a beautiful chiasm. It begins with, now all the earth was one language and one speech. And down in verse 9, it ends by saying, the Lord confused the language of all the earth. So we have this idea of language and earth at the beginning and end. So a nice inclusio, but then everything in between falls in a nice chiastic structure. And the middle of the chiasm is when the Lord comes down. That's when the story takes its turn, okay? So the people in verses 3 and 4 say, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. And then in verse 4, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. And it also says, so that we not be scattered over the face of the earth. So here's another point in their rebellion. God said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And the people are saying, we don't want to do that. We just want to stay right here, all of us. Okay, so through wanting a name for themselves and through refusing to spread out across the earth, we see that there's a heart of rebellion here in the people. Now, when God comes down to confound their language, there's a few different things going on in the story that are humorous, but also drive the point home. We've already noticed how the people have this statement of, come, let us do this. Come, let us make bricks. Come, let us build a tower, and whatever. When God comes down, or as he's about to come down. I'm sorry, it is after God comes down. It's in verse 7. God says, "Come, let us go down," and there confuse their language. So he mimics the people. Come, let's do this. We're going to make our name great. We're going to stay unified, and no one's going to cause us to spread out across the earth. And then God says, come, let us go down, and we'll see about that. And there, God confounds their language. Now, when God confounds the language, a fun little thing is happening in Hebrew. Okay, we have the Hebrew word is lebanim, and it means to build. Come, let us make bricks and let us build a tower, the people say. Lebanim is the word. Now in Hebrew, remember, you would usually just have the consonants being written. So you have LBN as the consonants. When God says, come, let us confound, he uses the Hebrew word nabalah. And if you look at the consonants, NBL, they're the exact reverse order of LBN. So the people say, come, let us build. God turns it around on them and says, come, let us confound. Okay. So the wordplay itself shows the confusion in the language. It's very clever. And as I say, sometimes it's not just the message that's being communicated in Genesis, but it's the way the story is actually written or told that communicates the message too. And this is a great example of that. So in fact, of course, that's what happens. Their languages are confused, and they cease building the city, and they go their own ways. Now, God isn't through with making little puns. In verse 9, it says, therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. So we have the word Babel, and the word here for confused is a different word. It's the word Balal. So it's a play on Babel. They called the city Babel because the Lord Balaled their languages. Now, to put that into English, let's do it like this. They called the city Babylon because there the people babbled on. You get the force of what's going on in Hebrew. It's a joke, okay? Making light of the people. Babel doesn't mean to confuse the language. The real meaning of Babel is gate of the gods. But it is actually a place of confusion because the people aren't worshiping God in the way that they should. And therefore, because their motives and their purposes are confused, God confuses the languages. So once again, the punishment fits the crime, as it always does when God sends a judgment. Okay, do you have any other thoughts or questions about the story here? All right, so we're going to take our next break, and then we should just have a short section left to kind of wrap up chapter 11, okay? So see you in a few minutes. Okay, so to this point in Genesis, we have now noticed 3 rebellions in the first 11 chapters. And in this story, all we see at this point is human rebellion. But there are a couple of other passages in Scripture that also show us there's a spiritual rebellion involved here. So I want to talk about these 3 rebellions and note that they are both human and spiritual rebellions. And this is the first year that I've taught this, because this is something new that I've learned in the last year. So it's never been on the Genesis midterm, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's on this next one. Okay. So anyone, the first rebellion and the participants in it, who was that? Adam and Eve, and the spiritual participant then would be the serpent. Yeah. Okay, second rebellion. No. It's true, it's a story about sin, and he's in rebellion, but yes. Okay, so the sons of God and the daughters of men. And then obviously the third rebellion is the one we've just finished talking about, but we need to do a little more explaining here to show you the spiritual side of what's going on at the Tower of Babel. And once again, we're going to have these heavenly beings, the sons of God, involved in this. So once you guys get that jotted down, flip on over to Deuteronomy chapter 32. And is there anyone here who has the ESV version? Okay, because that's the version that we want to read, and I'll explain why after you read the verse.
Deuteronomy 32.
Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 and 9.
When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples, according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion, his people, Jacob, his allotted heritage.
Okay, so Moses here is referencing at the time that the nations were divided, when the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations. Okay, so when is that? When were the nations divided? In our story here, the Tower of Babel. So Moses here is referencing the Tower of Babel. Now he says when this happened, he separated the sons of Adam, or the sons of men, and he set boundaries of the peoples. And the ESV reads, according to the sons of God. Now, some of you have other versions, like the New King James. It actually says, according to the number of the children of Israel, doesn't it? So what we have here are biblical manuscripts that read differently. But there's a number of reasons why I think the ESV has chosen the best translation here. And that is because the reading, the sons of God, is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are the oldest copy of the Hebrew Bible that we have. And this reading is also found in the Septuagint, which is the next oldest copy of the ancient, of the Old Testament that we have. So apparently at some point, because the next verse talks about Israel and Jacob, apparently a scribe somewhere along the way accidentally wrote children of Israel in one of the manuscripts. And that's one of the ways that that's come over into some of our English translations, okay? So if we understand here that what's going on is that Moses is saying at the Tower of Babel, when the nations are divided, God assigned the nations to the sons of God. And he assigned the people of Israel to himself. So following the Tower of Babel, we have the genealogy of Shem, which leads us to Abram, whom God chooses to develop for himself a people. And he no longer works with all of the nations in the same way that he does in Genesis 1 through 11. He now works through Abraham and his descendants. His desire is to bless all nations, but he's focusing on Israel. He leaves the other nations in the care of these other divine beings. Now that sounds kind of crazy, but if you think of other passages in Scripture, you realize that this is what's going on. For instance, in the book of Daniel, do you remember when Daniel is praying, and he's praying for a long period of time? I think it's something like maybe 3 weeks or something. And the angel, I think it's Michael, finally shows up. And he said, I would have been here sooner, but I was prevented from coming to you because of the prince of Persia. And he's not speaking about an earthly prince. He's speaking about a spiritual heavenly being who was fighting against him and preventing him from getting to Daniel. And that passage also goes on to talk about the prince of Greece as well as the prince of Persia. So what we see are these spiritual beings that are over different nations and countries of the earth. When we come to the New Testament, one of the temptations that Satan presents to Jesus is he shows him all the kingdoms of the earth. And he says, all of these can be yours if you bow down to me. So how does Satan get possession of these nations to be able to give them to Jesus? Jesus doesn't say, oh no, you don't possess them. He just rebukes Satan by quoting scripture to him, right? So, and then we also have in the New Testament, Paul talks about the spiritual powers of darkness and how our battle is against them. And he calls them the rulers and the authorities in the heavenly places. So these spiritual beings at the Tower of Babel, because of the sin, God enacts a plan. And that plan is he's going to release the nations into the care of these sons of God while he focuses on Israel to bring the promised seed through Israel so that eventually he can bless all the nations and draw all the nations back to him. Now the problem is that these divine beings rebel against God. And rather than governing the nations in a just way, they govern them in a wicked way. And we have that story. I want you to flip over to Psalm 82. We have it recorded here in Psalm 82. Whose turn was it? I know we had Blake read that because he had the ESV, but was it yours, Skylar? Okay, do you want to read Psalm 82 for us? It's just 8 verses.
A psalm of Asaph. God stands in the congregation of the mighty. He judges among the gods. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Selah. Defend the poor and fatherless. Do justice to the crooked and needy. Deliver the poor and needy. Free them from the hand of the wicked. They do not know, nor do they understand. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are unstable. I said, you are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High, but you shall die like men, and fall like one of the princes. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all nations. Okay, so this seems like a really crazy psalm. So let's just talk real quickly about what's going on. In verse 1, it says, God stands in the congregation of the mighty ones. The word here is Elim, which is another word for like gods. Okay, so God stands in the assembly or the congregation of the gods. This is the other heavenly beings, the sons of God. Okay, and he judges among the gods. Now, why is he judging these heavenly beings? Verse 2, how long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? And so he rebukes them and he tells them to defend the poor and the fatherless and so on. And then in verse 6, he says, I said you are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High. That is, they're part of God's heavenly family. But you shall die like men and fall like one of the princes. So God brings judgment on these sons of God, these heavenly beings, for acting wickedly amongst the nations that he had set them to rule over. And of course, Jesus brings that judgment when he descends into Hades, and then later when he rises from the dead, and he takes all rule and authority back to himself. When Jesus says in the Great Commission, all authority on heaven and earth has been given to me, he has taken it back from these beings. That's what that means. He has accomplished God's plan
which was not only for Israel, but for the nations. And now that he has died and rose from the dead, he is going to reclaim all of the nations for the Lord. And that's, of course, what the mission of the apostles is about then when we get to the book of Acts. It's reclaiming the nations for God. Okay, so a couple passages that, we're not real familiar with, Deuteronomy 32 and Psalm 82, and some kind of wild ideas, it seems like. But have you guys got any thoughts, questions, or I always like to say rebukes, rebuttals, because this is, I know, some probably some different things that maybe you hadn't heard before. But what it does is it ties all of this idea of spiritual warfare together in Scripture. We see how it all begins here in these three spiritual rebellions in Genesis 1 through 11, and then how God resolves it in the New Testament. But even in the New Testament, Paul tells us that our warfare is not against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual powers and so on. So even though they have been defeated and Jesus has all authority, nonetheless, they're still trying their best to draw people away from the Lord. But thoughts, questions?
You may have mentioned this, but in verse 7, these sons of the Most High, you're saying those are spiritual?
Yes. Now, some people interpret them as earthly judges. So there is another interpretation of this passage, but it's pretty clear from verses 1 and 2, and also what God says in verse 6 that these are spiritual beings. The word Elohim, which refers to the true God, is just a description of a divine being. God is an Elohim, and there is no Elohim like him. He is Yahweh, and there's no one like him. But there are other Elohim. These other Elohim are sons of God, spiritual beings that are part of his heavenly family. Many of them have rebelled against God, and here he is judging them. For instance, even Samuel, after he dies and Saul goes to the witch to conjure him up, when Samuel's spirit appears, she says, "I see an Elohim rising out of the earth." Now, Samuel's not God in the sense of the true God. He's an Elohim in the sense that now he is part of the spiritual world. And so these beings, the sons of God, the angels, all of these people, they're spiritual beings. So they're Elohim in that sense, but they're lesser Elohim. And that's why we have scriptures like, there is no God, or you are greater than all of the gods. Well, if there were no other gods, how could God be greater than nothing? So this reference of God is greater than all of the gods is a way of saying there's many Elohim, but there's no Elohim like Yahweh. He is supreme. Okay, does that make sense?
Just for the clarification, so these beings are different than angels?
Yeah, technically they actually are. There's actually different grades of spiritual beings. We have the cherubim and the seraphim, who are said to be throne guardians around the throne of God. Then we have the sons of God, who are mentioned. And then we have the angels. And the word angel, both in Hebrew and Greek, simply means messenger. So the angels are sent to do the bidding of God. However, what happened during the period right before the New Testament is that many of these terms were kind of combined, and the word angel then became the general word to use of the heavenly beings. Okay. Sure. Good question. All right, so that's quite involved, but hopefully makes some kind of sense. Again, it's something to study on your own. There's actually a number of good resources out there these days that explore that. I could point you to some of them if you're interested. But we'll press on with the genealogy, the second genealogy of Shem, verses 10 to 26. So let's see. Aoife, do you want to take maybe half of that, and then we'll let Blake take the other half since it's so long.
So read to
Let's see, what is that? 16 verses. So read 8 verses.
this is the genealogy of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begot Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. After he begot Arphaxad, Shem lived 500 years and begot sons and daughters. Arphaxad lived 35 years and begot Salah. After he begot Salah, Arphaxad lived 403 years and begot sons and daughters. Salah lived 30 years and begot Eber. After he begot Eber, Salah lived 403 years and begot sons and daughters. Eber lived 34 years and begot Peleg. After he begot Peleg, Eber lived 430 years and begot sons and daughters. Peleg lived 30 years and begot Reu.
Okay, and how far am I? 26.
Yeah.
When Reu had lived 32 years, he fathered Serug, and Reu lived after he fathered Serug 207 years and had other sons and daughters. When Serug had lived 30 years, he fathered Nahor, and Serug lived after he fathered Nahor 200 years and had other sons and daughters. When Nahor had lived 29 years, he fathered Terah, and Nahor lived after he fathered Terah 119 years and had other sons and daughters. When Terah lived 170 years, he fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran.
Okay, great. Now notice that at the beginning of the genealogy, this is the genealogy of Shem, we have the exact same names up through Eber. And then Joktan isn't mentioned as one of Eber's sons here. It's focused totally on Peleg, and then we follow the descendants of Peleg, which is what we had been talking about. Now this genealogy is similar to Genesis 5 in a few ways. Can you tell me some of the similarities it has with Genesis 5?
Also the repetitive like scripture to it, and sort of the detail of how old they were when they had their first son, and then how long they lived after.
Yeah, that's right. Great. So this same repetitive formula, and then how old they were when they had the son, and then how much longer they lived. So that reminds us a lot of Genesis 5. The other similarity is this is a 10-generation genealogy, just like the one in Genesis 5. And then there's one other similarity, but I'll mention that a little bit later. How about some of the differences? What do you see that's different here from the genealogy in chapter 5?
A lot smaller ages.
Okay, the ages are shrinking, aren't they? Yeah, not living near as long. What else?
There's no like attention drawn to a particular person in the genealogy.
Okay, yeah, it doesn't pause to talk about anyone in particular. That's good.
Until the very end where he lists three sons.
Yes, exactly. Did you notice also there's no death notice here? Remember in Genealogy 5, it always said, and he died. But we don't have that here. So it's a little more hopeful sounding, really. It's not that they didn't die, but by not constantly mentioning death, it's much more hopeful. And of course, what the genealogy is doing is it's bringing us to Abraham, who is going to be this man of hope. He's going to be the bearer of the promises, and God's going to make a covenant with him. So I'll just put a few of these up that we've mentioned. No death notice, lifespans are shorter. Also, as someone mentioned about the lifespans being shorter, notice that after Peleg, who lives during the generation of the Tower of Babel, that's when the lifespans really start to shrink. So Peleg lives only about half as long as his father. And then the ones after him, live roughly in the 200-year range. So that's interesting. following the Tower of Babel that the lifespan shrinks so drastically. Now, the other similarity is that, like Genesis 5, this genealogy ends with a man who gives birth to 3 sons. So in Genesis 5, it ended with who, and what were the 3 sons he gave birth to? Noah gave birth to Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So that's Genesis 5, and then here in Genesis 11, Terah gives birth to Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now we're going to see the reason for these similarities in just a moment. But the differences are also, I think, significant and worth noting. So what I'm going to do now, this is where we're ending, because we're going to pick up next Tuesday with the genealogy of Abram, which begins with verse 27. Actually, it's the Toledot of Terah. So this is where we're ending. So what I want to do now is pause. I'm going to do a few summary things as we look at the big picture of where we've come from Genesis 1 to 11, and then we'll be through for the night, okay? So the first thing I want to talk about is the significance of the seed. And I want to retrace our steps and show us the importance of this theme. Back when the sin occurred, God promised that the seed of the woman would triumph over the seed of the serpent. Then in Genesis 4:25, Eve rejoiced that God gave her another seed in Seth. And it was with Seth's son that human beings began to call on the name of the Lord, as you might remember. Now this seed is corrupted by the sons of God. Think about that. God has promised that a seed will come that will triumph over the seed of the serpent. So these evil spiritual beings, the sons of God, what do they want to do? They want to destroy God's good plan. They want to corrupt the seed. And so they intermarry with human women. Okay, so this is literally a devilish plan to try and thwart God's good plan. And to me, this is another reason why the sons of God clearly aren't the descendants of Seth, but are in fact these heavenly beings. But the seed is preserved through Noah. God saves Noah, brings him through the flood, and Noah is scattered. But one of the branches of Noah's genealogy leads to Abram, which is where we ended up in verse 26. And next Tuesday night, as we do read the genealogy there involving Abram and his call, we'll see when we get to chapter 12, verse 3, that through Abram's seed, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So these 3 human and spiritual rebellions have not been able to thwart the good plan of God to save all of the nations. Okay? But Abram is going to be the chosen vessel through whom God is going to work to bring his seed into the world to bless all. I think it's really interesting that the Bible doesn't start with the history of Israel and just begin with Abram, but it puts it in a worldwide context. Because this says that God has always been concerned about all peoples. He didn't choose Israel because he loved them more than anybody else. He chose Israel because he loved everybody, and it was his plan to use Israel to bring all of the world back to him. Okay? All right, I see some writing, so I don't want to flip off this screen yet, but let me know when I can move on. Or maybe I can go back at the end of class if someone's not quite through and put this slide back up for you. So this is just a quote that I have here that I thought was a really good summary of Genesis 1 through 11. The complete primeval history is designed to demonstrate the need for God's chosen people and his wisdom in choosing sinners to bear his promise, since there is no cure for a sin-infested world apart from God's promise and plan as worked out through them in the nation of the Savior for all people, Israelite and non-Israelite alike. It's a mouthful, but it sort of sums up what we just looked at in this promise of the seed, tracing that through the first 11 chapters. Okay. Final slide. We've been noticing a lot of parallels between the early chapters of Genesis and the later chapters of Genesis. So here they all are on one slide, and I want you to see just how impressive this actually is. So we have creation and we have new creation. We have separation in both and a new separation. We have water from the water and water from the earth, as we do in the second. We've got the blessing on the animals. We've got the blessing on mankind. We've got the made in the image of God. We've got Adam and Noah as the new Adam, and we've got the stories of the sin involving nakedness. Okay, that's the top part. As far as relationships go, the same four relationships are emphasized: the ground, the animals, human beings, and God. As far as the stories of sin go, we have the sin of Adam and Eve, which is a sin involving fruit. We have the sin of Noah, which is a sin involving fruit. Now, Adam and Eve have three sons who are mentioned. That's Cain, Abel, and Seth. And Noah has three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Two of the sons of Adam and Eve are righteous and one is wicked. Two of the sons of Noah are righteous and one is wicked. Cain is cursed. Canaan is cursed. The sons of God and the daughters of men are a spiritual rebellion against God. The Tower of Babel is a human and spiritual rebellion against God. And finally, we have the genealogies in both sections. We have the descendants of Cain, and that might parallel the descendants of Noah's sons or the map of nations that we covered tonight. Then we have the 10-generation genealogy in chapter 5, which is echoed in some similarities in the 10-generation genealogy in chapter 11. We have the line of promise being emphasized here, both in chapters 5 and 11. The Adam to Noah connection and the Shem to Abram connection. And Noah and his family are the bearers of hope, just as Abram and his family will be the bearers of hope. Does that blow your mind to see this? I mean, sometimes you read through Genesis, you might never catch this, right? Unless you, as many scholars have done, study it deeply. But this is impressive. This is this whole idea of typology that we're talking about too, how the later stories recall the earlier stories. And so they're emphasizing certain messages. They're certainly emphasizing God's faithfulness, God's desire to bless and to give life. They're also emphasizing human sin and how wicked human beings can be, but that God, in spite of sin, is intent on bringing blessing. There's also another pattern that I didn't put up here that you can see in these early chapters, and it goes like this: blessing, sin, judgment, blessing, sin, judgment. So, final thing I want to say to you guys, okay? You look at this, you think of all the chiastic structures that we've talked about in Genesis 1 through 11. You got this pattern of blessing, sin, judgment, blessing, sin, judgment throughout it. These are not just kids' stories about, that we learned in Sunday school, Adam and Eve and Noah and the ark and Cain and Abel and all that. These are very, very sophisticated stories that tell the deep truths that God wants to communicate to his people. And they are beautifully and artistically and thoughtfully inspired and written. Okay. I hope this helps impress you even more with God's word and with these first 11 chapters of Genesis. And the rest of Genesis is no different. We're going to see a lot more good stuff as we go through. So any final comments or questions? I know it's Friday, it's late, you're tired. So let's go, and I'll see you guys next Tuesday night. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for being understanding.
No problem.